First of all, thank you so much for the invitation to present. Let me get a gag out of the way to save you time. I was meant to speak earlier, as you know. So the situation is the speaker on precognition was unavoidably delayed due to unexpected circumstances. Okay, we're I'm talking about precognition. I don't do it. All right. Okay. So first of all, the topic of precognition, I must admit, I've had an interest in parapsychology for many years, decades, in fact, although I've only just recently been able to become actively involved in it. And of all the topics within parapsychology, the one that, if I can say, does my head in most is the topic of precognition. So what I'm going to present is essentially my attempt at making sense of this phenomenon to myself, and I've come up with a framework which seems to make sense to me. Hopefully, it may make sense to you as well. And as I said, it's simply a work in progress, the way I see things. So let's kick the show off. Right. So what's going to be the basic organization? That's the structure of the talk. Is it real? How the brain actually does prediction, because your brain is actually a prediction machine, certainly from what we know of the neuroscience, and how the information that one obtains precognitively, how might that be organized, and also what is the role of consciousness in this? So let's start off. Is it real? I would probably draw most strongly on the work of Julia Mossbridge and Dean Radin, who've done extensive work looking at the phenomenon of precognition, and there are different ways that you can look at it. One way, which they have looked at, is what happens when you view a series of images that are coming up at random times, where the random times are determined by a quantum random number generator. Now, there's a well-known effect that autonomic nervous responses and skin sweating, if you will, are influenced by the images that you see. So you see a slightly scary image, a lot of blood and gore, etc. Your skin conductance will go down. In other words, and you'll be able to measure that as essentially a response, something like that. Now, what Julia Mossbridge and Dean Radin have looked at, and they're not the only ones, what happens before the images occur? Now, in this case, this large response is the changes in conductance that you would expect, the changes you would expect, and that you see with a frightening image, an arousing image. And this one down here, a calming image, scenery, etc., etc. Now, what is interesting is what happens before the images actually occur. In fact, before the computer decides what the next image is going to be using its quantum random number generator coin tosser. And what you find is, in fact, before the scary, arousing images occur, there is already a response. And the point is that the computer hasn't even decided what the image is going to be. And they've looked through the statistics carefully as to what could account for it, etc. And very simply, just that finding alone, is inconsistent with our current understanding of the laws of physics. Might as well just get used to that. The other thing is the work of Daryl Bem in 2011. He published a paper in a very prestigious journal, and what he looked at was a priming task, a relatively simple one. You have to press one or two buttons whether you find the image pleasant or unpleasant. So, for example, if it's a spider, you'd press unpleasant. Now, what happens is, before the image is presented, there's a word that comes up, and that word is quite random. That word can either be consistent with what you're going to see. So, for example, in this case, unless you really love spiders, that word, beauty and spider, is inconsistent. And what you find is that if the word and the image are consistent, you tend to respond faster. And if they're inconsistent, you tend to respond slower. Very well established. Nothing terribly new there. What Daryl Bem did was flip the experiment around. So in this case, the thing that primes it occurs first, then the image that you've got to judge, and then your response. What he did was he puts the image first, and he says, now respond. And then randomly, a prime comes up. Now, what's fascinating, this is a weaker effect, but what's fascinating is this. If the prime, well, it's no longer a prime now, it's just a word that comes up later, happens to be consistent with the image, you are faster. And if it's inconsistent with the image, you are slower. Now, the point is, after you've pressed the quantum random number generator, then decides what is the word going to be. It occurs after you've already made your decision. It's as if you were aware of what the computer, the random number generator, was going to actually come up with. Once again, even though the effect is a few milliseconds or seconds, it is inconsistent with our current understanding of the laws of physics. Now, you might sniff and look down your nose at, precognition of a fraction of a second before. But there is actually more anecdotal evidence of long-term precognition, events, days, weeks, sometimes even years. And they're seen most frequently, probably in things like remote viewing, where someone is given a target and in some cases asked to indicate what the target is, when the target is determined by a random process later in time. In other words, that the target hasn't even already been selected, and yet they are relatively accurately able to assess what that's going to be. And then there's, of course, there are anecdotal cases of dreams, Mark Twain, for example, having a dream about the death of his brother, etc., etc. So there are these anecdotal cases. So how might that occur? What I'd like to suggest is, how might this information that we're able to tap in the future in some fashion, how might it be organized? And what I'm suggesting is there may be a metaphor in the way the brain organizes itself and the way the brain makes predictions, because the brain is making predictions all the time. Literally every aspect of its function involves a prediction in terms of not just what you do, the movements, but the words that you say. And sometimes problems with that predictive process give rise to what are thought of as psychiatric disorders. So let's start off with the brain itself and how it might be organized. What we know is that within the brain, all aspects of its behavior is essentially predictive. This is going to be a metaphor. So let me give you one specific example. Suppose I'm deciding I want to have a drink of a cup of coffee. I want to take a sip from a glass of coffee. Now, the decision is made in the prefrontal cortex, etc., and then it cascades down to the motor cortex. Now, the point is this, that within the prefrontal cortex, the prefrontal has already predicted what the outcome is going to be. It's already predicted seconds in advance and as to what's going to happen when that glass reaches my lips. So it's predicted seconds in advance. Other parts of the cortex, the associated motor cortex, are making smaller predictions about what the arm is going to do within the next fraction of a second. And right down to the motor cortex is going to do is make decisions about which muscle fibers to activate. And those predictions are made within milliseconds, thousandths of a second. So what you've got is a cascade of predictions. You've got longer term predictions at the high level of the cortex. You've got intermediate level predictions lower down. And, at the action end, the predictions are very small, but at every stage, the brain is making predictions. What I'm suggesting is this layered approach of longer term predictions occurring at a higher level and shorter term ones occurring at a lower, may be the way that information is organized in terms of the information that we tap precognitively. Now, okay, this is a hypothesis. I'm not saying it is true. I believe it makes sense. It's drawn on the way the brain does it, but you know, that's my prediction. So the way I tend to visualize it is the information is stored in these higher non-physical levels. Now, Julia Mossbridge has suggested that information that we tap precognitively is not encoded in the physical universe. It's encoded in this other consciousness-based domain, which she refers to as the pervasive universal consciousness. That's where the information is stored, PUC. And what I'm suggesting is that this PUC may be organized at these multiple levels, high levels, essentially encoding information about things that are going to happen maybe years or decades in the future, whereas at the lower level, maybe events that are going to occur within seconds. So this is what I'm actually suggesting, and that precognition is somehow the process of tapping information at these higher levels. And depending on how high one goes, it goes further and further into the future. Julia Mossbridge has pointed out that people who engage in meditation, loving compassion meditation, and a sense of transcendence, so some sort of what I would interpret as high level, seem to be able to tap further into the future and tap better. So there's sort of some suggestive evidence of a link between, if you will, the level at which one can, the level of consciousness that one can attain, high levels of consciousness, and further into the future. So that's the other sort of suggestion. And this is in fact where what I'm suggesting, precognition occurs. Okay, well that's possible, but the issue is the future predetermined? Where is the information occurring? Now, probably the first time where this notion that, well, actually the future is completely predetermined. That's why you can determine it. That's why you can sense it precognitively. Laplace, French philosopher, mathematician, more or less first presented this argument most clearly. You know, if I knew the position of every atom in the universe, I knew exactly what its momentum was, and, you know, I could just use Newton's laws, I'd be able to work out what was happening in the next second, year, millennia, millions of years, etc. Everything is predetermined. Your free will is an illusion. Basically, everything that's happened has been predetermined, including your appearance at this conference, at the time of the Big Bang. It was all just, if we just had enough computing power, I would have known, you know, it could have been calculated. That's the basic theory. Laplace wasn't the only one. Einstein also, mainly because of his work in general relativity, was also a determinist. And you can sort of see there was that quote, etc. And the way that Einstein saw it is a model of the universe called the block universe. So basically, you've got 3 dimensions of space and you've got 1 dimension of time. So basically, it's a 4-dimensional block. And if I sort of said, I'm going to describe the movement of my finger in time, so it starts here, goes there, you can actually, if you look at the block, you will actually see that whole movement as one hit, because time will be this axis, position will be these other axes, etc. So the block universe, many people draw on the block universe as a means of explaining where does the future information come from. Well, it's always there because the laws of physics determine it. Is this true? Well, let's have a look. There are a number of problems with it, and not just quantum mechanics, but one of them is the whole issue of the butterfly effect, chaotic systems. If you have something which obeys the laws of mechanics precisely. So, for example, you've got a cannon, and you know exactly the velocity that the cannonball fires out. There's no air resistance, there's pure gravity. You know exactly. You can calculate exactly where it's going to land to the accuracy of, if you will, a fraction of a millimeter. And in other words, your uncertainty as to where the cannonball is going to end is determined by your uncertainty as where you started and the velocity. So let's assume you know the velocity exactly. The only uncertainty is if you're uncertain within a meter of where your start position, you will be uncertain within a meter of where it lands. If you're uncertain within a millimeter, you know where it lands within a millimeter. Well and good. The problem is, life's not like that. The universe is not like that. Basically, systems, complex systems, anything more operate under gravity, more than two bodies, the so-called three-body problem, is uncalculable. You cannot calculate. You don't have a simple equation which will tell you precisely what it is in the future. There will always be errors. And this is where this famous sort of notion about the butterfly effect. A very small uncertainty and unknown in the equation at the very beginning blows out. And this is what happens with chaotic systems. Basically, you might say, well, all we need is more information. Okay, so if I want to calculate what's going to happen with the cannonball over there, if my accuracy is 1 millimeter here, but because of chaos, the cannonball is uncertain, 10 meters, for example, when it lands, well, why don't I actually go to a fraction of a millimeter, a nanometer? That will make my calculation more accurate. Yes, it will. But the point is, the longer in time that cannonball flies, the bigger the error becomes. It grows exponentially. And this is basically what happens with the in complex systems. So if you wanted to know where all of you were going to be at the time of the Big Bang, you would need an infinite amount of information for every particle field there was to be able to calculate that. Well, some of you might like to sit back and say, well, okay, give me an infinite amount of information. What's wrong with that? The problem is this, that information and energy are related. There's an interesting relationship there related to a physics theory called Landau's principle. It's to do with entropy, but just take my word for it, please. Information does not come free. If you need infinite information, what do we mean by infinite information? Okay, suppose I want to know the position of something here measured on a scale. So 1.0001. I've got 3 zeros. That tells me how accurate it is. But if I need an infinite amount of information, I need an infinite number of numbers after my decimal point. And those numbers are going to be random. You don't know what they're going to be. So essentially, I need an infinite amount of information to get an infinitely fine accuracy. But that means I need an infinite amount of energy. And the universe does not contain an infinite amount of energy for every electron and every atom you want to track. And so using just the simple Laplacian idea, let's just calculate, does not work in real life. So the point is, the block universe is not going to give you the answer. So what I'm sort of suggesting is that the information occurs at these higher levels. The other point that I want to make is the information gained precognitively does not appear to be deterministic. It appears to be probable futures, possible futures, not this is what's going to happen. And I'll discuss more about that. But the other thing is that long-term predictions about the future have occurred in many different contexts. One, particularly people who are experiencing deep near-death experience. And some 12% of individuals seem to be able to be aware of events that subsequently were confirmed. Now, look, it's very hard to do scientific research on that because you're relying on anecdotal evidence. And, people's memories change, fade, etc., etc. But to me, I thought that was certainly interesting. And there are cases where there is actual written evidence. So the other point is that the experience of those individuals is not, this is going to be your future. It is, you have a decision to make. If you make this decision, this is what's likely to occur. If you don't, it'll be another direction. So this is not deterministic. There is an element of choice, and yet both sequences seem to be able to be mapped out. So the question then is, where does this information come from? If this information about the future, where on earth does it come from? And here again, we're going wildly speculative, so hang in there with me. What I'm suggesting is it's consciousness, where I define consciousness in the broadest terms. I don't mean just what I'm currently aware of, normal waking consciousness. We know that cognitive processes, desires occur at an unconscious level. So, okay, I'm mixing up terminology, unconscious and conscious, but I would include all those. We also know that certainly animals exhibit consciousness, but there is evidence that cells exhibit cognitive capacity and consciousness. And if you look at the philosophy of panpsychism, the notion is that consciousness is an essential component of the universe. It is as fundamental as matter, energy, etc. So what I'm actually arguing is that essentially it's consciousness all the way down. Apologies to Carl Sagan, some of you will know that one. Turtles all the way down is the other line. The other point that I want to make is, does consciousness simply stop at the human level? I don't think so. I mean, many people experiencing near-death experiences refer to an enhanced, enlarged state of consciousness, so different that they find it extraordinarily difficult to describe it when they return. And it seems to me not unrealistic that there could be much higher levels of consciousness. And I see no. And what I'm saying is that in terms of consciousness, I'm talking about all of those levels playing a role. And there is evidence for that. There is evidence that, for example, animals, chickens, for example, can influence the outcome of events. But let me just continue. What I'm suggesting is that information about likely future essentially occurs at these levels and is created at these levels and becomes the present. So how, you might say, how on earth could consciousness influence physical events? Because, they're physical, and consciousness is sort of certainly it doesn't seem to obey the laws of physics that we understand. So how can these two completely different things influence each other? And what I'm suggesting is it's, even though they look dualistic, there's this and there's that, they're completely different. I'm suggesting that, in fact, both the universe, the physical universe, as we understand, and the domain and universe of consciousness both emerge from something deeper. That's a variant of, you could call it neutral monism, but it's something that has certainly been suggested, was one of the original criticisms of Descartesian dualism. How can something completely different nevertheless interact? How could mind or consciousness and matter interact? But the point is that if they both emerge from something deeper, they actually share a deeper reality, they can interact. And what I'm suggesting is the capacity for consciousness to influence unfolding events in the physical universe is related to the fact that they both emerge from this deeper reality. So what I'm suggesting is symbolically that consciousness, influences literally the content of these higher, what I call temporal causal levels, which in turn lead to the emergence of events in the present. And these are probabilistic. In other words, they're not definite. they may occur, and they, at the present, they then occur. There is evidence that, in fact, the information that occurs representing the present is somehow still tappable in the future. In other words, being able to be aware of what events happened in the past. Stefan Schwartz, who's done a lot of work on remote viewing, and particularly remote viewing using that for archaeology, would suggest that you're able to be aware of events that occurred in the past, accurately. So what I'm suggesting is it's probabilistic or random events that are probably the most susceptible to the influence of consciousness. So what I'm suggesting is, in a sense, that this basically includes all those other levels that I mentioned, and as well cosmic levels. In other words, I'm taking it all the way up from essentially elemental particles of the consciousness right through to the entire cosmos, the entire universe, and maybe multi-universes as well. So what does that mean? Does it mean that if it's consciousness that influences the content of these higher temporal causal levels, this pervasive universal consciousness, which becomes the present? In other words, this is a loop, a retrocausal loop, which enables things to happen as a result of your focused intent. And I'm arguing that it's focused intent that brings that into existence. So what does this suggest? And this is one that really spooked me. You've probably been aware of this notion of the law of attraction, manifestation, etc. Think of something and it's more likely to occur. I got to admit, I used to sort of look down my nose at that, because generally because most of the things that seem to be wished for seem to be just material things. I'd like a Rolls Royce, I'd like this, I'd like that. Okay. And I thought, look, all that's simply happening is people have basically primed themselves to look for that, and that's all it is. But in fact, this would seem to suggest that no, there's more to it than that. There may well be an influence. The other thing, and here I realize I'm in the presence of Lance and his most recent books, synchronicity, the occurrence of meaningful coincidences. And related to that, the phenomenon that Arthur Koestler was fascinated with, the library angel. In the days before Google, if you were writing a book on something, you'd have to go to the original records. And one case was described to Arthur Koestler. Dorothy West was writing a book about the Nuremberg war trials. And she was going through that they weren't indexed, they weren't catalogued in any way. She was looking for a particular record of one component of the trial. And it was this huge room with these pack of files there and books. And she had no idea where to start. And she'd almost given up, and she just reached for just whatever happened to be closest, opened it at random, and there was exactly what she was looking for. Now, sure, you might say, well, that's how many times did she reach for a book and it wasn't there? Yeah, the point is that these things occur, the specificity is remarkable, and it seems to occur much more often than one would expect. And in fact, there's an increasing interest of research in synchronicity. And Lance, of course, hope you don't mind my mentioning this, has just recently published what looks like a fascinating book. I haven't had a chance to buy it yet, but I will. But I would argue that synchronicity could well be a consequence. I mean, you're thinking, just imagine, you're in a situation, someone that you love very much has just died, for example. You're thinking about them because quite obviously you're missing them, you're distressed, you're thinking about them. One day you get in the car, you turn on the radio, and there's the favorite tune that you both happen to like. Just come there. There's other examples that's given there. I suspect that it's both your conscious and unconscious processes that are literally influencing future events and creating them. And there is evidence that unconscious processes can be quite complex and think things through, not just very simple organic things. We know, if I could just take an aside, that the process of creativity, there is an unconscious component. In fact, it is unconscious. There's many cases of people thinking about a problem, getting nowhere, and then one day, apropos of nothing, it pops into their mind. And we know, in fact, that these cognitive processes are taking place below the level of consciousness. Why can't these processes, subconscious, influence these temporal retrocausal loops as well, so as to create the circumstances that we see as synchronicity, etc.? The other thing, which I think is a crucial one, particularly in parapsychology, but well beyond parapsychology, is the experimenter effect. There's evidence that, if you believe that a phenomenon is possible, let's say in parapsychology, you're more likely to get results that are consistent with that positive result. If you're a skeptic, particularly if your meal ticket depends on you being a public skeptic, you will find that every experiment you touch turns to, put in the appropriate word there. So the point is that the experimenter effect, I believe, goes significantly beyond parapsychology. There's the whole issue of the replication crisis in psychology, and also actually in medicine, some of the drug discoveries as well, where I think in the early 2000s, 100 published papers describing certain effects, published in high-impact journals, etc. People then tried to replicate them. Okay, do I get the same results? Of the 100, I think the figure was somewhere around 30-35%. In other words, most of them did not replicate. Now, okay, there are reasons for that. It could be that, in a sense, you didn't have enough people, the experiment was underpowered, etc., etc. But I think an important factor is the attitude and beliefs of the experimenter. The experimenter, whether you like it or not, is a part of the experiment. And, I say this with some mixed feeling because I'm currently doing experimentation, looking at mental telepathy between identical twins. And I'm getting some interesting results, which is code for positive. And I'm worried I will only really believe these results when an independent party replicates that. How much of my findings are influenced by, the fact that I've got a very positive attitude, even though I'm not there at the time of the recording, I might add. So I think the experimenter effect is an important one, which goes way beyond. The other point that I sort of want to finish on is the role of consciousness in the creation of certainly life, organic life as we know it. Paul Davies, in his book The Demon and the Machine, published around 2018, 2019, argues that the sequence of chemical processes necessary for the creation and origin of life is just so improbable. He refers to it as climbing Mount Improbable. Now, the point is that if, in fact, consciousness can influence physical reality, both directly but also indirectly, in other words, into the distant future, via these retrocausal loops, might not consciousness play a crucial role in the origin of life, in climbing Mount Improbable? So, the perspective presented in this talk, as I said, are keeping with mystical and philosophical principles. The tradition that views humanity as part of a participatory universe, and it suggests that our individual and collective impact on the world around us, and even beyond, may be deeper and more profound than we could have imagined. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for this presentation. Later on, I'm going to have to go somewhere quiet, sit down and try and process all this stuff because there's so much information in this. You've melded physics, psychology, and I'm heading into spiritualism here because one thing you mentioned that kind of jumped out at me was you saying that people who do the loving kindness meditation, potentially have insight further into the
Yeah,
future. And
yeah.
that kind of reminds me of Hinduism, where literally the idea is you open up your heart with love and you get closer to God, Brahman, which is ultimately the creator and the entire universe. And so potentially, as you get closer to God, there you are better able to see into the future and possibly manipulate it, as you're suggesting. Any thoughts about the similarities?
Yeah, the only there are. I think the point that I would like to make is if you look at the way the universe is organized, and the way biology, astronomy, all these things work, there's what's called nested hierarchies. Things are made up of smaller things, and those smaller things are made up of small things, and it is part of a bigger thing. So, for example, you can look at the liver of a horse, and then you can look at the whole horse, then you can look at the herd, then you can look at the ecosystem. Uh, all of these things, these nested hierarchies, the same thing with cosmology, where planet in the solar system is part of the local star group, the local star group is part of the galaxy, blah, blah, blah. I suspect consciousness is also organized in these nested forms. So in other words, we're part of something bigger, but that's in turn part of something bigger, and in turn it's part of something bigger as well. So at each level, maybe over time we progress, but I don't believe that it's sort of well, I'm up at this level and then flip, I'm in touch with the entire universe of everything. I think there are grades. There's a degree of modesty required.
Thank you, Professor Richard. Very interesting talk. In your studies of brain mechanics, which you've spent 40 years doing, what have you found in terms of quantum quantum effects in the brain, faster than neuron communication, tapping into something like that? Do you think it has some effect with precognition? Thank you.
Yeah. Look, there's a number of things. My personal research, the equipment I've used, the apparatus, is far too crude to look at those very fine detail. There are a number of scientists looking at quantum biology and quantum processes within the brain, and I think they could be extraordinarily important. There is a theory using quantum mechanics to try to explain precognition, and I'll take you through it very quickly. It's the term is retrocausal entanglement. So here's the idea. You're familiar with the notion that if two particles, say two photons, emerge from the same process, they are what's called, in quantum mechanics, they're actually a single system. They're treated mathematically as a single system, and that's called they're entangled. So what happens is if you make a measurement on one of them, it will influence the other one instantly, no matter how far apart they are. Literally, there could be a pair of photons emitted at the time that the universe came into existence, and it falls in your eye. That makes it a measurement. And literally, the other pair of photon, 13 at 26 billion light years away, is instantly affected. Okay, that's quantum. So in other words, systems that have in some way emerged can maintain this through what's called entanglement. Now, normally entanglement is considered to be extremely fragile. You need very, very low temperatures, etc. But there is evidence that it still occurs within the brain, which is warm and wet, and etc. Now, okay, how can quantum entanglement give you precognition? Well, here's the idea, and a number of scientists have suggested this. One, probably Sheen, is one of the main ones. He's based at Department of Physics, UCSD, San Diego. Here's the idea. You can have entanglement over time. In other words, an event that's going to happen in the future seems to influence the current event. It's been identified, etc., and it's sort of a temporal entanglement. So the idea is this. Your brain in the future, and here again, you're sort of using a block universe, is entangled with your brain in the present. And if you see something, you experience something, somehow through entanglement, your brain in the present receives that information from the future. In other words, it's coming from your brain in the future, influencing your brain in the present. And there's a physics theory about things going forward in time, backwards in time. It's called retard and advanced potential. This is not the time to talk about it. No pun intended there. Okay. Now, the issue is, okay, that's a theory, but for that theory to be correct, the events that are predicted in the present have to occur during the lifetime of your brain in the future, because it's your brain in the future that is entangled with your brain in the present. Now, the problem is people have been able to precognitively be aware of events after they've died, that occur after they've died, or that occur that they never got feedback on. They were never, in other words, in some way, you've got to get that information in the future for it to come tracing back to you via entanglement. If you never get that information, if there's no feedback, or you die, that's the end of the physical brain. It can't be entangled. So my view is that is an unlikely explanation of precognition. That's a long way to answer. It may not be what you were asking, but it's interesting.
I just wanted to ask about the experimental effect that you were talking about. Is it possible that, in my experience, when I've been around certain people who have been able to achieve certain gifts, it's like I'm empathing off their gifts, and I can also, I don't know, because it's energy, right? And when you're in someone's field, you can kind of get their quantum field,
Yeah.
abilities. Could that also play into the experimental effect where the person who's, running the experiment has those abilities, and then you get someone who completely has no clue?
Yeah. Look, two parts to it. First of all, as far as the experimental effect, if what I'm saying bears any relation to reality, the experimenter doesn't have to be in the same room. The experimenter doesn't even have to be thinking about it at the time. It could have been half a continent away, and someone think. In fact, you could have a situation where people who are skeptics, who believe that parapsychology is a load of garbage, and who have a passionate view, this cannot happen. I wouldn't be surprised if those very attitudes can have an effect on experimental success as well. Now, as to the notion of some sort of field, I tend to see that, first of all, it's real, but whether it's the sort of fields that physics measures, I don't know. The other point is, as far as quantum processes are concerned, there are quantum processes. Whether they can account for the sorts of experiences you have, which I believe are real, I don't know. But what I do think is that quantum processes are a very useful metaphor explaining how things are. You won't be able to write equations for it, but I think it's pointing us, that idea is pointing us in the right direction. That's all I can say on that.
All right. I was just going to ask about something you mentioned offhandedly a little earlier in the presentation.
Oops.
You mentioned there being experiments showing precognition in animals, specifically you said chickens. I was wondering if you could elaborate on that, or maybe direct us to where we could find those kinds of experiments.
Yeah. I'm just thinking the main one, I was with the chicken one, I think I may have got a telekinesis experiment. Yeah, sure. Look, I'm happy to sort of do that through whoever, through you, maybe certainly send you the reference. The work I was thinking of is a French group, and I think they're called POEH. I don't know but basically what they were doing was they had young chickens. Chickens prefer to be in the light and prefer to be warm. And what they first see they are impressed with it. So in other words, the first moving thing they see will be mother chook. That's the way they get. In this particular case, what the experiments that had a little robot device on wheels which could move around, and its direction and how far it moved was determined by a quantum random number generator, and it had a light, and that's what the chicks sort of were impressed with. That's mother hen, and the chicks were then in a large cage which was dark. They were restricted to an area of the cage, and what they looked at is, does the mother hen light spend more time around the chicks, because that's theoretically what they want, and the answer is that yes, and that stuff's being replicated as well. So now that's not exactly precognition. That's really more micro-psi, etc. So maybe I misspoke on that one. I know there is some, but it's not coming to me at present. So my apologies.
Yeah, my bad. I think you did say the effects of their consciousness, so not quite the same thing. But
Yeah,
thank you.
yeah.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you. That's very interesting.
Yeah, on a rather somewhat related subject, actually, I remember reading a book on premonitions years ago, and I was quite intrigued about it, actually. But just in relation to the premonition side of things, actually, what the difference is between a premonition and a precognition, I'm not sure, but I'll defer to your judge. But anyway, just for the sake of the argument. But I do recall I read in, I think it might be Australasia Post or something, or somewhere, there was an academic in Melbourne. I think he wasn't from Melbourne University. I can't recall who he was there now, but I might have it in my paperwork at home, voluminous paperwork at home, actually, somewhere. But I think he understandably, for any scientific validity of a premonition, you have to record it before the event, and not sort of after the event. Otherwise, but so it's got to be any serious evidence about it. You have to record it before the event. Now, as I recall in this article, he was setting up a premonition bureau, I think, at the Melbourne Institute of Technology or something other. But what happened to it, or what further came of it, I really don't know at all. Actually, no. Yeah. So
yeah. There was a premonition, so-called premonition bureau, organised in the UK, organised by one of the newspapers, and Julia Mossbridge reviewed a book about it, and she described it as how not to organise a premonition bureau. But there were a small number of individuals, 3, who kept on getting it right. Most people didn't. Okay, to me, a premonition, that's a sort of a feeling about the future which may or may not be correct. Precognition tends to infer an element of consciousness about it. I think there's a large overlap between premonition and precognition, large overlap. There's some interesting evidence. For example, the number of people traveling on trams in the United States, and this was in part of New York. This was a study published in the 50s, looking at, so they were having accidents all the time. And what they found is that the number of people who seemed to be on a tram that was going to have an accident that day seemed to be statistically smaller than you would expect when you look at the numbers of people on that tram other days, etc. So it was a 55, 52 study, etc. I have read some comments that fewer people came into the Twin Towers before 9/11. I haven't seen sort of hard evidence for that, but then I haven't really looked very hard. But it would make sense. Ross behind you is nodding his head, so he probably has got the reference. So I'll leave it here. Okay. So yeah, there's a large overlap between the two, premonition and precognition. Yeah.
Can you comment on the relationship between intuition and precognition? Because I have a friend of mine who can actually feel through her body when the earthquake is happening, and it's always correct.
Yeah. quite a few years ago, I gave a talk about intuition. And the issue is that the term can cover so many phenomena. From you meet someone, you get a feeling about them. But in many cases, those feelings are the way they move, their appearance, etc., the way they talk, subtle things that you may not be consciously aware of. And then there are these other deeper processes, for example, where, I mean, you mentioned one example there, but there's evidence of similar things sort of happening, which has been shown in what's called the Global Consciousness Project. This is where you have a global network of quantum random number generators. And normally, because they're random, they're completely uncorrelated with each other. But when certain events seem to occur in the world, and the famous one is the death of Princess Diana, for example, it's as if the field somehow gets disturbed, and they seem to become more correlated for a brief period of time. And people have looked at that quite closely. Roger Nelson is the person who's done most work on that. So what I'm saying is that some people might sense that, and they would refer to that as an intuition. And it's basically any means by which we obtain information not through what we would rationally sort of see becomes what we refer to as intuition. So it's a whole series of things. So the answer is yes, but I include everything in that.
That actually reminded me, the random number generators, there's an app you can download called Entangle. I think it's a fairly new app, which essentially gives you random numbers on your phone, and it's kind of almost your personal little gauge. The idea is that they collect data from all over the world to get some sort of global information, but you can also monitor your own personal trends. And I've noticed, I don't know, perhaps in my imagination, but I've noticed that it does seem to correlate to periods where there's something significant happening, perhaps an emotional state. If you're intensely angry or so, for that hour, it'll actually beep saying that you've had a significant deviation from there. And that always kind of throws me because, I can't explain how that would work. But yeah, I'd recommend the Entangle app. Try and get as many users on it as possible. Yeah.